there are growing tensions in the Middle East as the death of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh had sparked renewed tensions in the region after he was killed in a state guest house in Iran. Now, there are questions about who the next Hamas leader will be and whether or not Hamas will be retaliating with the support of Hezbollah, given that his visit to Iran was very specifically a solidarity visit to Hezbollah following the death of their leader. Joining us to unpack this a little bit further is visiting professor at the Wits Business School, Professor Jannie Rossouw. Jannie, good evening. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. Perhaps to start here, is this likely to lead to retaliatory attacks from Hamas?
Good evening, and good evening to the viewers, Oliver. Yes, the expectation is that we will see retaliation. This will definitely not help to move the Middle East region to a ceasefire. It's not going to help matters to reduce tension in the Middle East. The US already responded by sending more forces, the carrier strike group 3 with more fighter jets to the Middle East, stating that it will help to protect US interests in Israel. So these steps lead to increased tension in the Middle East, and this is really not what the world needs at the present point in time.
Yeah. One then has to ask, was the IDF wise in executing Hamas leaders, specifically in Iran? Because it may well elicit a retaliatory response from Iran, given that it happened in a state house, but as well as Hezbollah.
Yeah, indeed. These questions currently we cannot answer. And at the same time, Israel was involved or is involved in ceasefire discussions. So you're not exactly involved in ceasefire discussions and at the same time kill certain leaders. So from a point of view of arranging a ceasefire in Israel or in the Middle East, this also becomes very complicated. For me as an economist, the bigger question is, how will this play out next week on the world's financial markets? How will we see international financial markets reacting to this increased tension in the Middle East? What will the economic fallout of all this be? What will the effect on the oil price be? Those types of questions we will only see the answers to next week.
Yeah. This was done through the intervention of Mossad spies that were able to get cooperation from certain actors inside of Iran. One then has to ask, is Iran squarely behind the people of Palestine in this instance, or can allegiances be seen to have split in this instance, given that certain state actors in Iran may well have, as preliminary reports suggest, cooperated with Mossad?
Yeah, it seems that there might also be different factions within Iran, as you've said. And again, this is not clear at the moment. This might lead to increased instability within Iran over time, as there is now clearly tension within governing structures in the country. The other very important question, of course, is, will this be an individual response against Israel, or will be a concerted response comprising more countries reacting against Israel? So from that perspective, we will also have to see how it plays out in the coming week. But as I've said, my main concern is the economic consequences of all this. For instance, higher oil prices, which will feed inflation, which will imply that interest rates will remain higher for longer. Those types of effects we can also not predict at the moment.
Given where the United States of America is at the moment in its political life, on the eve of an election that's 4 months away, the tune around whether the country has an appetite to continue to fund aid towards Israel in the fighting of this war is something that is also of concern. One then has to ask, does a moment like this, an incident like this, deter more support coming from the U.S. government? And in particular, can they afford it?
Well, the U.S. government already committed more support. They will send Carrier Strike Group 3, which includes the Abraham Lincoln Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, to the region. So they've already committed more resources. So from that perspective, it's difficult for me to judge what the U.S. can afford and what it cannot afford. The U.S. is just about 20 or 25% of the world economy, so they can afford many things that other countries cannot. afford. But I also have to make another point. It seems to me that Israel was always very good on controlling media sentiment around tension in the Middle East and to get media sentiment for its own positions, for its own action. And in this instance, since the problems started in Gaza in October last year, it is as if Israel has lost control of its media influence. So Israel is losing what I call the media war in the Middle East, and it's going to pay dearly for losing the media war because the international sentiment is now turning against Israel, whereas Israel had a lot of international sentiment during earlier wars and skirmishes in that region.
Will the continuous sentimental shift the world over against Israel impact its potential sanctions against the country, given that the International Court of Justice has declared its occupation of Palestine as illegal, unlawful, and effectively an occupation that is tantamount to secession? One then has to ask is the impacts and the conversation around sanctions against Israel, do they gain momentum when there's a shift in sentiment?
Yeah, with shifting sentiment, we can indeed see this happening. I read somewhere that some commercial airlines have already suspended their flights to Israel until further notice. I have no idea how long until further notice is. So your summary is very spot on, very accurate to say these changing sentiments might in the end lead to sanctions against Israel, if not against the whole country, then sanctions against certain leaders in Israel.
Can Israel afford sanctions?
Israel, in my view, cannot afford sanctions because it's busy with a very expensive war. Wars, by their very nature, wars at the scale in Israel, by their very nature, is expensive. And as we know from South Africa's history, when South Africa had the border war against Angola about 40 years ago, and we had sanctions against the country, economically, South Africa paid a very, very high price for that, and in the end couldn't continue in such a way. So over the long run, sanctions will have a detrimental effect on Israel, depending on which countries introduce sanctions against Israel and depending on which types of products.
Yep. Professor Jannie Rossouw, thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate your insights.